What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of our Chill podcast. Today I'm joined with Joe and Stopa, best friends and software engineers with true hacker mentality. After years in big tech, they both left Airbnb and decided to build stuff together. Currently, they're working on a startup called Instant, a modern firebase which aims to revolutionize idea of databases inside browsers. In 2022, Instant joined YCombinator and is already available to build your next application on it, so just give it a try. Honestly, I was shocked by the founder mentality and vibe of these two amazing individuals. That's why I'm extremely excited about this episode. So without further ado, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Joe and Stopa. Enjoy. Hi guys, once again, and before we dive into our conversation, I want to share a very short thing that the moment I heard about you and your story, it was directly super fascinating to me because I also have this best friend with whom I'm just doing this software engineering things, learning things together, doing side projects together, and that's why your story was super. I was super curious in your story because of that. So all my questions today will be super genuine, and I'm genuinely interested to talk to you guys. And okay, let's start from the very beginning. So you're best friends, as I know, partners in crime, everything. And how did you meet? And how did all this start?
Started in 2014. So I moved to San Francisco to join a coding bootcamp. And this was so early days that, for example, we would sleep in the office of that bootcamp. So it was also kind of free housing. And one day it's like 9 p.m. I'm studying, and this guy comes in. His name is Joe. They say that he's Georgian. And I tell him, "Oh, hey, you're gonna become my brother."
Yeah.
And
who is they? I'm just curious.
they what?
Who is the they?
I don't know what you mean.
You said they said I'm Georgian. Who is the they?
Oh, I would think maybe Shaw.
Oh, Shaw said I was visiting. That
Yeah.
makes sense. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean that's how it all kind of started. Then I would say it was we had kind of an email based friendship for a bit. I didn't have a physical phone, so we would communicate over email, and we said let's meet up at a hookah place, and everything started from there. What do you think, Joe?
Okay, cool. And now, speaking of this friendship again,
Yeah.
I personally find it super boring to do things alone. Be it like learning, working on a side project, whatever. And to me, it's super fun, and I always get super excited when I'm doing with my close friend, for example. And I don't see many people have this opportunity to have such close friends. And for me, I was just lucky, and I suppose it just happened to you randomly as well somehow. But could you maybe share for those people some tips how they can kind of make such friends with whom they can do these things together and have fun?
I'm curious though. What do you say? Oh, you go first, and then I can go.
Okay. So the question is, how do you make really close friends?
Yep.
Is that the question? I think it's like a combination of things. And I don't know if I 100%, or maybe when I'm 70, I'll know this 100%, but my current theory is...
We're 30, in case that helps.
Yeah. So
That's
as
the
a
context.
30-year-old,
Yeah.
what do I think is important? I think first, there is an aspect of you want to know how deep you want to go, right? So for example, often you'll be at a company and you'll meet some people there, and the default might be that you guys are just coworkers, right? So if you want to be more than coworkers, you need to be the one that sets the standard. How deep do you want your friendships to be? So I think the most important thing is actually for yourself to answer this question: how deep do you want your friendships to be? right? And then for me, the answer is I want them to be very deep. I want to have relationships that are at the level of family. So because of that, whenever I come into these kind of like friendships, I try to go deeper, move it forward, go to do hard things together, right? So I think one, the most important aspect is just to know how deep a friendship can be, right? Like, what is your standard? And then there's kind of less big things but important things, which is you gotta do the things that you really like to do so that you can find people who are like-minded. You gotta have really high character so that you find other people who have really high character, right? You need to do things hard things together because otherwise the bond won't deepen. So that's kind of my take. What do you think, Joseph?
Boom. I think I'll echo some of the things that Stopa said. I definitely think one way that you make deeper friendships is by doing hard things together. You see this in general, right? Maybe you have like a group of friends that you hang out with after work, right? Maybe you're part of, in my case, Stopa and I, we do jujitsu, so we have friends from the gym, right? But sometimes some of the friends from the gym, they become closer because we end up saying, oh, why don't you come over for dinner, right? So now we do something more personal, right? Then, maybe someone becomes even closer where we go maybe on a trip together, we go to a tournament together, right? Then maybe, we start doing even more things outside of jiu-jitsu, right? I always feel like, if you go on an international trip with like a group of friends, that's probably like a big step. You just don't do that with most people. So, and this isn't true with just friendships. This is also true with romantic relationships, right? As a romantic relationship progresses, you start doing these kinds of things. So I think doing hard things together, being real, having intention is very important. I think also like one of the ways I think about that is those are kind of more like downstream or down funnel things. Another thing that's important is just increasing the chance to meet people. Like the reason why I met Stopa was really random too. Like I just was showing up as like an alumni to visit my friend who I referred to this program. If I never came on that day, I might not have met Stopa. So I think it's the way Stopa was saying, like, what are the things you're interested in? I think it's very important to also actively like put yourself out there, like expose yourself to randomness. So that's another idea, like expose yourself to randomness, expose yourself to meeting new people, because you never know who you're going to connect with.
So speaking of this jiu-jitsu, there's funny thing about hackers, like all hackers kind of are about jiu-jitsu, right? So that's so cool. I love that. Okay, now like speaking of these hard things, okay, which you do, and I suppose like these hard things might be some personal things, obviously, but let's now go into our kind of tech direction in our conversation now. So when did you start building together? I don't necessarily mean startup or some big project. Maybe something small. When did you come up with that idea to build things together?
I think like our first project was probably jobsearch.dev.
Yeah, I would say it was like there were kind of two in terms of like doing hard things together. There were two phases. One was just like friendship, doing hard things together, which I think was like the first 3 years. So we became roommates. We went on like these long travel trips. We saw each other like go through.
We went to Georgia together.
We met my parents in the village. Brought my mom flowers. That's the kind of man he is.
Also met my whole family in California.
Yeah. So I think the first aspect was kind of becoming very comfortable as friends and seeing each other through kind of like different life events and how we handled it. Eventually, around I think maybe 2018 or 2019.
It was like right before we started Airbnb. We had like a month before we started, and we were like, "What if we do a project together?"
Exactly.
Because we already knew we wanted to work on something together, but we hadn't worked on something yet. And we had this like 1 month time period before both of us took an offer at Airbnb. So we had this 1 month time period before we started.
Exactly. So we just did this like very intense thing together where we effectively like applied to like 20 different companies and got a bunch of offers and did all this negotiation together. We would send each other screenshots of messages and figure out how to respond together. And fun fact, we still do this today. Like when I was trying to like message my girlfriend originally, sometimes I ask for feedback. But
when we did jobsearch.dev, right, we had these like goals with the project, right?
Yeah.
But one of the first goal of that project was actually to validate, can we work together well and can we deliver?
Yeah. I guess like maybe kind of meta idea that I think is related to the first question is like very often people get scared about going deeper in a friendship because if you go deeper, like what if it doesn't work? Right now you might lose a friend, right? So there's all this discussion on, oh, don't work with your friends because if you do and it doesn't work out, now you've just lost a friend. But I kind of think about about it the other way. Like if you want to have real friends, like really go deep, like you need to be able to risk that. You need to be able to cross that chasm, right? So I think Joe and I did that experiment together. It was really fun. Of course it was intense too, right?
If you want a more extreme take on this, Phil Lubin, the CEO of Evernote, he has a talk at YC Startup School where his whole case is basically like, you should only work with your friends, and if you're afraid to like work with them, then maybe they're not your friends. Maybe that's a little extreme, but it was very interesting to hear a very passionate case for that.
Yeah, I actually do agree with you about working with friends because like I feel super comfortable working with my very close friend because it's like more than like partnership in that process. It's just some bond, emotional bond which you enjoy to work with that person. So, and I think that increases this efficiency and kind of final impact. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, by the way, you mentioned this job search, and I of course have seen it, and it's super amazing. And can you very shortly tell us what it is? Or yeah.
Sure. So Stopa and I, 1 month before we started Airbnb, we're like, let's work on a project together, and we had just completed a job search ourselves. And one of the things we kind of realized was like, oh, both of us had this shared experience in that we used to work at startups and then we worked at Facebook. And after Facebook, when we went to work at Airbnb, this was kind of our second large company. And having gone from a startup to a big company, we understood that like when you work in a big company and when it comes to like interviewing and hiring, there's certain things that are different, especially in a really more senior role than it is in a startup. But what we noticed is in our own interview prep, no one else was talking about this. People talk about things like, hey, you got to lead code. Hey, you got to like, know how to do these kinds of different problems. But at a big company, when you start going for like senior and staff and higher roles, there's other things that are important. There's concepts about signal. There's concepts about scope. There's even an idea where like some people, they think I negotiate at the end. But we talk about like, no, actually with the big companies, a lot of times most of the negotiation happens in the beginning because you're going to be put in a certain loop based on the level that they think you're at. So it's very important that you communicate that in the beginning, right? And then there's other things. There's like mindset ideas. A lot of people, they look at a job search and they're like, oh my God, I have to do this. Versus our opinion is like, this is, it's like an inflection point. It's a point to make a very high leverage change in your career. And you shouldn't look at it as a schlep. You should look at it as an opportunity. And you shouldn't look at it as something that you need to do alone. You should look at it as something you should do as a team. So again, there's all this like interview prep material out there, but we felt like, hey, there's a certain area that no one is talking about. So, we made jobsearch.dev. It's like a free, basically video course. There's also a text accompaniment that kind of talks about the way we view doing the senior plus job search as an engineer. So, and we made it again, first to validate can we work together? And then 2, we also just wanted to give back to the community. So yeah, and everything that we put in there is not just kind of like theoretical stuff. It's actually things that we did. We got some feedback from some people who said, why didn't you recommend this? Why didn't you recommend that? And, it was really important for us to recommend basically the exact things that we did. So that's jobsearch.dev.
Amazing, guys. So I will definitely leave it in the description so everybody can check it, because I think it's still valid and a good resource to have. Even like not for seniors, like to have general impression about this job search process, it's pretty good. So thanks for that. Okay, now you also mentioned that you worked on this job search, kind of your first collaborative project before Airbnb, right? You had this some time before that. So now I want to ask, how is it like having a full-time job at Airbnb or wherever, just having a full-time job and at the same time working on side projects? I mean, was it possible for you, or you just could not find time for that during that period?
Yeah, honestly, it's like this perennial battle. Like originally when we were working at Airbnb, we had this goal where we said, okay, we gotta be responsible. Like we're not gonna quit our job until we have not only a startup idea, but we have the startup is working and it's making revenue that's like greater than our salaries, right? But I do think effectively it's unrealistic because
maybe other people could do it.
Yeah,
we
just couldn't. I think the difficulty is like sometimes people think like programming, especially like at these big companies, it can be more like cushy in the sense that, you know, a lot of stuff is handled for you, right? At Facebook, like they would, if your shoes were broken, like they would give you new shoes, So a lot of stuff is handled for you, but it's very mentally taxing, and especially if you join in some of the senior levels, etc. You do have these responsibilities that kind of take up your highest level of thinking, right? So when you're in the shower, that's what you're going to be thinking about. So eventually, I mean, we built like little side projects, but I think if I were to share like one idea, I feel like a lot of developers kind of beat themselves up because they work at companies and they think, oh, like, why am I not, producing this other startup on the side and succeeding and selling and marketing? I think just the reality is everything takes way longer than you think. So I would just say don't beat yourself up. And for us, we definitely were not able to do it while working.
Yeah, I agree with Stopa. I think like definitely there are a lot of cases where people worked on the side and they were diligent and they made this thing and they grew it while working, and like those people are awesome. I think it's just very hard, especially when you have like other things going on with your life. And even if you can have the time for it, I believe that like engineering and like especially making like great software is like a craft, and it does take like creative energy. So that creative energy might be taken up at your full-time job. So for us, yeah, the moment that we stopped working full-time, like it was like a night and day change in terms of ideas and the amount that we were able to produce.
Okay, that's cool. Thanks for this honest response and sharing your experience. I mean, that's super cool. And like sometimes we get like from the social networks, like the success stories, only success stories, and we only hear that people were working on 5 startups simultaneously, having two full-time jobs at Facebook, etc. And yeah, I mean, reality is way different. I totally agree with you. And okay, now let's move on one step forward. And okay, now please help me to understand the logic and the decision-making process behind like leaving this kind of good job at Airbnb and like starting your dedicating your full time to your kind of passion, okay, to this building process. What was the idea behind that?
Well, okay. I think, something that's important to say is like, first of all, Stopa and I, we had the luxury to be able to leave, this full-time job and not worry. Neither of us, had a mortgage, had a family to like take care of. So, we just had a lot less responsibilities. Also, like Stopa and I had, already multiple years of experience in the tech industry in the Bay Area. So we had a serious chunk of change. And all of this, I think this is important because it, one, just gave us the security to, not have a salary for a while, but it also like helped us think about our decision making. Like Stopa and I made like really big moves to get into software, right? Originally, we weren't in software. And when we got into software, that was like a step function change. And now working at these big companies, like we understood, like, look, we can still work at these places, right? We can still make, good money, right? But is that really going to be the next level change? It didn't feel that way, right? Both of us had a vision of like, there's a certain way we want to lead our lives. There's a certain impact we want to have, right? Amongst our friends, amongst our community. And if we kept doing the things that we were doing, we would just continue on this linear path. So we just understood if we want to get to the next level, we have to do something different. So, for us, I think it was like a decision that was like, of course, this is the next step for our journey. I think there's another aspect that I think both Stopa and I just, even before we were in tech, we probably had something that, I know for me, I think the same for Stopa, we just had something that said we want to do our own company. For me, both of us, we did YCombinator in 2022, but for me, it was like a dream to get into YC. I think one thing that's very interesting about humans is we have the ability to imagine things and then manifest them into reality. And whenever, I'm able to experience that, that just literally feels like magic. So, for us eventually getting into YC, that was like, wow. For us building this company, that's like, wow. We have, a friend working with us, one of our really good friends, who's now helping us out with Instant. And that's like another dream come true. So all this to say, like, our decision-making process for leaving Airbnb and doing this, one, there was an aspect of, just having the security to be able to do it. But two, it was, following our personal vision.
Yeah, I think that's well put. Like, if there's one idea I would share on some of this part, it is important to asterisk that like some of the things we're gonna say don't make sense if you have like 4 children and are like have a lot more responsibilities. I think often people are in much more freer positions, but they give themselves a lot more constraints, right? So for example, there's like cultural values. Like if you grew up, for example, in Eastern Europe, one thing your parents might say is something like, "You're lucky to have a job," right?
Exactly.
And I think this is exactly, and I think this is something that's kind of it's in the zeitgeist, right? So you're growing up, you're saying to yourself, "How can I quit Airbnb? Oh, I'm lucky to have a job," right? But actually, that's not the reality anymore, right? The reality in that situation is, you're not lucky to have a job. You can have many jobs, right? So this isn't just to like pat yourself on the back. This is important because now the constraints that you have are different, and the opportunities that you have are different. The things that you might lose are different, right? It's not about keeping the job. It's about now potentially self-actualization. Like, how much are you learning? Like, in which direction are you going? Like, what's your technical development? How good do you want to be? What's your in what areas do you want to develop, right? And sometimes it's like, because we don't question those underlying assumptions, I'm lucky to have a job, we ignore this very important question that at least in some people's scenarios is actually much more important, right? It's much more dangerous to ignore that than to ignore the possibility of like never getting a job again.
Right. I think one analogy I like in terms of like poker is like sometimes you have to ask yourself the question, are you sitting at the right table? if you're sitting at the wrong table, sure, you might be doing well, right? But you might not be able to actually reach the potential that you have, right? So being able to think about that, right, and walk away, right, and go somewhere else, that could be potentially the most important change that you'll make, rather than sitting at the same place and playing the game that you've been playing.
Cool, guys. Amazing to hear your story. So, and like when I was kind of preparing for our discussion, I was walking through Stopa's essays. And by the way, people, like Stopa is running his kind of personal blog. We can call it like that. He writes some essays time to time, and they are super interesting. I mean, super interesting. And I just came across your essay about leaving Airbnb, and I was just reading, and there's one paragraph when you met Brian Chesky, and it was you were writing about it. And can you share a small, very shortly, how that happened? How was that story about?
Sure. So what happened was,
It's a good story.
it's a pretty good story. So what happened was, it was my birthday, and Joe, as a birthday gift to me, gave me. He said, "Look, let's go to this Airbnb experience together." Right. So it was a Saturday. I remember that day. I like went to the office for just like a little bit of work. I have this Eastern European background, so at that point, I was wearing full red tracksuit with a gold chain. And I know the gold chain, in America, it doesn't look very good, but my parents gave me that chain, and like I wore it for the longest time. So I was rolling out my Adidas red sweatshirt, and about to go see Joe. So then, okay, Joe, you can continue on.
Well,
and one question: what's this Airbnb experience? Is it some special thing, or can you?
So Airbnb has two products. One is like you can live in an apartment in Airbnb, but there's another product where you can have special kind of experiences, like go to a walking tour or a photography tour, right? And one thing that we believe, whenever you join a company, it's really good to just like actually use the products. So we wanted to use the Airbnb experience product, and we signed up because I also like martial arts. Joe signed me up for Bruce Lee in San Francisco, because Bruce Lee visited a bit. So I went there, right? I'm getting these phone calls from Joe. I don't answer the phone, right? I go in, I see Joe, I see some person, and then I see Brian Chesky. I say, "Oh, hey, Brian."
With a gold chain, right? And red.
Yeah.
Good.
You just happened to. Yeah, as Stopa was saying, Airbnb experiences are just they're another product on Airbnb. It's basically like booking a tour. You imagine you go travel, maybe you book a hotel, maybe you want to book an excursion. That's what an Airbnb experience is. And yeah, it just so happened that Brian Chesky booked that same one. So he was on the same tour as us.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, there are no... I strongly believe such things don't happen randomly. I mean, it's crazy to imagine that such things can happen. Okay, now...
Interesting. Yeah, like he was the kind of guy that, for example, like he was so kind of open and cool, and then afterwards he said, "Let's grab some drinks," and then, it was just like talking to a person who really loves the company they're working on, and that could be pretty cool.
It was definitely a cool experience to, just meet him, talk to him. We told him, yeah, we want to do our own thing. So he was very encouraging.
Cool. Okay, so now we got to like probably the most important decision in your so far career, like when you left this Airbnb and you kind of... So what's next? What happened next after Airbnb?
We moved to New York.
We moved to New York. Wow, yeah. Was that okay? I guess like 1 month later.
Basically, yeah.
I think the way we started off was like this. So maybe some of this can be useful too when you're thinking of things. Like the first thing we said was, we're going to give building a startup at minimum 2 years. So I think this can be very important, because very often when people quit, they give themselves pretty intense expectations. They say, okay, within the next 3 months, I need to, have a product that's succeeding. But I think it's just not realistic. Like, that's not what happens. Like, when you launch a product, usually nobody uses it. So, so you're setting up yourself for a difficult time, right? So we said, okay, first rule, we're going to do 2 years of this, right? The next rule, we said, okay, well, what are we going to do, right? We didn't quit with an idea. So how do we kind of approach this? And both Joe and I, we really believe in like the hacker ethos, Lisp programming. So one idea is always to start with something small and grow it. So we started with the, I think, 2 rules. One was we would only work on things that we wanted to work on, like something that was interesting to us. And then the second rule was everything that we worked on had to be harder than the previous thing. So this kind of gave us the freedom, because the very first thing we worked on was like a diary app. Joe made an app for food logging, but it only logged his food. You couldn't even use
Like the first thing, because the thing is like kind of
Cool.
like while we were at Airbnb, it was like really difficult to actually do like full on side projects. So kind of like even the first thing we did before like being like, hey, let's build a business. The first thing that we felt is like we just needed to refuel our creativity. So both of us actually did not work together, but we separately were like, okay, let's spend like a month and let's just build our own apps from scratch. So
yeah,
that was the very first thing that we did.
exactly.
And then we moved to New York and we had to be quarantined for 2 weeks. So during those 2 weeks, that was our first project together post Airbnb, and we made an iOS app. Neither of us had ever had an app in the App Store. So the goal of this was to kind of, one, just like ship something to the App Store, but two, try to do a whole project from like beginning to end in like, 2-3 weeks. So, and then like, yeah, like literally once we were out of quarantine, we were done with that, and that felt nice. And that was just meant to be like a small project. That one we didn't even mean to be as a business, but it was interesting how like after we launched, some people thought we were really launching it as like a business. They were talking to us about investment, and we're like, whoa.
That is one other kind of surprise when you launch things. I remember once I wrote an essay about how to write a Lisp interpreter in Rust. And on Hacker News, people gave feedback like, oh, like, this isn't a good enough language for me to use. And I think some people thought that I had invented like a language. So, sometimes launching can surprise you.
Which I think there's like a corollary to that. Like, if you are working on like side projects, like you should really focus on launching. Like you should really anchor to launch things you do, because that's another form of exposing yourself to randomness. Like you never know what's going to happen. So, you should definitely launch.
Okay, and speaking of launch, okay, like before we get like to this final startup, which kind of took off, and you kind of are working on it. Like there were some projects, right? Some Zeneca, you had this book sharing thing, which I absolutely loved it when I saw it, and you had some training app, right? Which helped you to kind of get in shape or something. So, and when you say launch, okay, so to me as a tech person and a hacker, it's super hard to imagine what do we call a launch. Is it just to launch and use it by myself, or just tell somebody, some friends, or what do you call a launch of these side projects?
To me, I think it really is about telling other people, and like whether it's posting it on Hacker News, on Reddit, on your social, you really should put it out there. I think Paul Graham, he actually has like an essay where he basically encourages people to write publicly, because he says that like obviously when you write your essays publicly, maybe it can't be quite the same as what you would write just for yourself, but doing that will make you a better writer. And I think similarly, like launching publicly to other people will make you a better engineer. So yeah, to me it is very much public. What do you think, Stopa?
I think so. I think maybe one question is it's a launch when you're doing something a little more uncomfortable, where you could fail, and where it doesn't come because you're a programmer. I'm putting it because it doesn't come naturally to you, right? So if you're not doing those things, it's a smell, right? And I think, as Joe says, it does reveal so much, right? Like just seeing another person, even if you're building something you yourself use, seeing another person use it will level you up. Like you will see things that you would never have considered before. So as a an example of a launch, like the simplest thing could be just share it on Facebook, right? The level above that is put it on Hacker News Product Hunt, right? But you're doing it when you're trying. Like if somebody signs up on your startup, do you talk to them, right? Do you send them an email? Are you like, hey, what are you doing, right? When you're doing things like that, you've kind of moved into the realm of launching.
I think if your product has like a payment aspect to it, like adding a payment,
Huge.
way, that's huge. It's very common, I think, for people to launch things and there's no way to take money. Doesn't mean you have to do that for everything, but I think that's another one where, if that makes you uncomfortable, that's maybe a sign that you should actually do it.
Yeah, well said.
Cool. And Joe mentioned one of essays of Paul Graham. And speaking of Paul Graham's essays, how to get startup ideas, guys. How to get these ideas about the projects. And how, maybe you can tell me from your experience about Zeneca and this fitness app, Consistent, I guess it's correct name, right?
Yeah.
How did you come up with those ideas? Do you see problems and solve them for yourselves, or how did that happen for you?
At least on my end, I'm curious what you think, Jose. I do think that the thing that prevents people from coming up with startup ideas, one, like I think you should, like, there's a person much wiser than us has written blog posts. I will defer to Paul Graham's advice, but I think maybe experientially, I think the places where startup ideas can get difficult, one, people want something that sounds really big, right? Like they want to be cool, so they're like, oh, like I want this to change the world, right? And this can often obfuscate what an idea is, because an idea should be something that's like clearly understandable, right? What was the initial version of Apple? Like, hey, instead of soldering a computer, we will do that for you. Here is a computer. Like that is a concrete problem that's being solved, right? The second problem is, I think people don't give themselves enough time, right? So again, if you quit your job and then you need to come up with this like life-changing idea in 3 months, right? Paul Graham says this, and I really agree with it. Like, you really endanger yourself, because what could end up happening is you come up with a plausibly bad idea. You come up with an idea that sounds like a good idea, but is actually a bad one, right? And that's the worst kind. So I think the way you can do it is start solving problems you yourself have. Start small so you can actually ship the problem, right? Like you can actually get it out, right? And then you can see how people behave with it. And then over time, not only are you evolving that idea, but you're evolving kind of you're evolving the place in which you're coming up with ideas, right? Because now if you're talking to users, if you're yourself hosting something, for example, now all of a sudden you have new problems that are much more related to, problems that people will pay for. So I think that's the thing I would say is give yourself time, solve your own problems, start simple, start like with clear problems that you have, right? And then don't worry, because an idea isn't an instant thing. That's a great name, but it's more a time-based thing, right? So an idea evolves over time. What do you think, Joseph?
I think I think all those are true, and as Stopa said, definitely PG's got some great essays on this. So if you want to read more about that, I think you should just read PG's essays. But I think the way that we came up with Zeneca was we were just having a conversation, and one of the things that Stopa said was, if he was already wealthy, he doesn't think his life would change that much. But one thing that he wants one day is to have a very nice library in his house. And I thought to him, well, he's my bro, I want to make him happy. I can't get him a real library. But what if I got him a virtual library? And then that got us to talking about like, oh, we had this interesting, it was just this observation I was reading at the time, Naval's Almanac. And I had just noticed, I looked at like Patrick Collison, I noticed that all of these people, when they share their favorite books, it's always like a bullet list. And I was like, this is so interesting. It feels like the two choices people have for sharing their favorite books is like a bullet list or it's Goodreads. But, both of them, in our opinion, were just visually unappealing. So we thought to ourselves, what if there was a beautiful way to share your favorite books with other people and to connect with them? And that's how the idea of Zeneca was born. And the initial version of Zeneca was just have a simple page where someone can show off their favorite books. And that's how we did Zeneca. Eventually, when we decided to move on from Zeneca, we were back in this phase of coming up with new ideas, right? And we were looking around, like, what are the problems that we have ourselves? What are things we really want, right? We still use Zeneca today. It's still the way. If you guys want to see our favorite books, you can go to zeneca.io/Stopa or zeneca.io/Joe. Those are mine, right? But what's another thing that we want for ourselves, right? And, one of the things Stopa told me is he wants six-pack abs, right? And I was like, I want six-pack abs too. But not only that, but because one of the reasons why we moved on from Zeneca was because we realized, at that point we had already 1,500 people signed up. We realized that books was something that people were not engaged with on a daily basis, but really closer to on a weekly basis. So we were also thinking, again, this combination of like, what do we want? What's something that people need to engage with on a daily basis? And that's how we stumbled on fitness, right? So, all of this to say, like, there was also this randomness and how these things happened, but we really did lean into what are the things we want, what are the things that we know, right? And just kind of would riff on that until we settled on something new. The way we then ultimately ended up on Instant was the way we were building Consistent. We were heavily using Firebase, and we were just running into all of these problems. And Stopa had written an essay before basically talking about like what would the next Firebase look like. And in working on Consistent, we realized that, well, we're kind of building this anyway, right? And Consistent, it was a product where, hey, like, people were engaging with it and we were getting results, but we realized that this kind of a business would be more of an operations business. In our opinion, less so of a tech business. And we wanted to lean into our strengths as engineers. So, that's what made us then be like, okay, we kind of have to build this ourselves anyways. What if we just made that our full-time focus? And this is something that we believe that, we understand and we know some secrets that other people don't. When we had our first YC interview, and this is something that, they write on the website, but they ask like, okay, first question they ask is like, what are you working on? And then you tell them what you're working on. And then the next questions they say like, okay, why are you the right person to work on this? What's 3 things that you know that no one else knows? And I think this is a really interesting lens to think about ideas from, because there's kind of this like classic business way where you think what's the total addressable market and, how's the big vision, and that can be important. But there is something that's also interesting about like, what is the founder fit? Like, why are you the one to solve this, right? When you start also thinking about ideas in that context, I think that can be very powerful, right? So one way you can think about ideas is what is problems I have? What are things I'm motivated on, right? Another way you can think about is like, hey, what's the next big thing? Right? Where do I see the future coming, right? And another lens is thinking about like, what do I know that no one else knows, right? This is a whole big Peter Thiel thing in 0 to 1, right? And I think a combination of these approaches can help a person come up with ideas.
Yeah. I think like kind of to add to that idea of what do you know that nobody else does, I really like that. And I think the corollary. This is why we bros. We make each other better. Can you say it one more time?
Corollary.
The corollary to that is that is that let's say now you're like a 21-year-old, right? And you're trying to start a startup, and you might like legitimately ask yourself, like, wait, like, I want to start a startup in this area, but I'm not very good at it, right? Like, I want to be a technology founder, but I don't know how to program. What should you do in that case, right? Like, this is where I think the long time horizon can really help. Well, if you give yourself a few years, like, you can become an expert in a lot of things, right? So the answer isn't like, oh, it doesn't matter to be an expert. The answer is, okay, well, if you want to start an AI startup and you don't know how to do AI, that doesn't mean like don't do it, don't think about that and only do the thing that you're good at. That means just, okay, then you gotta be real, like, actually become great at AI, like, spend 2 years like getting good at that, right? At least. So I think that can help a lot when you're thinking about these things. Like, all right, maybe you want to go into this space. All right, then just get really good at it. Like, when we were in fitness, we weren't experts in fitness, but we were also like, okay, well, we're willing to put in the time to become experts, right? And we started reading, I like started getting a certification for becoming a personal trainer. Basically.
That's cool. I mean, I like it. That's cool. Okay, like, we finally got to this sweet part of our conversation, and let's kind of dive deep into Instant, okay? So Joe mentioned this essay you have, which was even before Instant idea was kind of came up, right? This essay of yours about database in browser, right? Can you, like, before we get into Instant, can we kind of talk about this idea, first of all, about databases to put in browsers, and then let's talk about two very common examples like Firebase and Supabase, and what are the things you liked based on your essay in those, and what are the things they were missing?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, yeah, okay, let's see if I can do a good job of this. It's an essay's worth of speaking. But I would say it's like this. First, if you really, really love building apps, right? You go in, you're using the tools, and you start noticing something, which is, what does every web developer do? You stand up a database, you have a bunch of HTTP endpoints, right? Then you have a front end where you use something like React or Redux, plus some store like Redux, etc. And now you have this whole system, and you're trying to build this app. The first thing you notice is like, okay, well, every time you need to add a feature, you change the database, you create a new endpoint, and then you shuffle that data back to the front end. Now, if you want to make that experience delightful, you don't want to wait for the server every time you click a button, right? So what you do is you start implementing like optimistic updates, right? And if you want to get really, really good, what you start trying to do is, okay, what can you make it work offline, right? Can you make it work multiplayer, right? So you start building these kind of bespoke features, right? But if you think about it, what you're really doing is like, what is the HTTP endpoint? It's just an indirection layer for a query to the database. And when you're doing an optimistic update, what is that? It's just doing a transaction, but you're writing it manually yourself, right? So this is where kind of the idea database in the browser comes in. Well, what if you had a database that you could talk to? You could say, I want these kind of queries. And then the database connected to the server and got you just the data you need, filtered it out so that it makes sure that you only see the data you're allowed to see. Now a lot of these problems are solved for you, right? And I think the service that came closest to this idea was Firebase, because when you're using Firebase, it's like you're using a database in the browser. You can actually enable it so it even works offline. When you make a change, honestly, Firebase feels faster than most apps that take much longer to build, because every change you make is applied optimistically, right? The big downside of Firebase is now you have everything in a document store, but what's the reality of all the applications that we build, right? They're all relationships, right? I'm building a task management tool. I'm building a Notion-like tool. I'm building a books, Zeneca, right? Like what's that? Well, there's users who have bookshelves, who have books, right? What's fitness? You would think that's kind of more document-like, but no. Well, okay, I have days, I have a log, logs have food items are connected to other things, right? So ingredients, right? So all of a sudden you start needing relations, right? And I think that's kind of where the idea for Instant was. Like Supabase is also very interesting in that they for example kind of stand up an HTTP endpoint for you, but the local story isn't quite there because it's very hard to do relationships locally unless you use something like SQLite. So that's kind of where our idea came. Can we make it so that you could use something like Firebase but literally have relations? What do you think, Joe? Does that cover the story?
Sure.
What do you think, Acho? Does that cover it?
Yeah, it kind of covers it, but maybe like one last shot. Now maybe like very shortly, I don't know, however you do it to, however you explained it to YC, like very shortly, right? So what is Instant right now?
Joe, see you.
Well, basically, we say that, Instant is the modern Firebase. We're a client-side database, and we make it easy for people to build real-time and collaborative apps like Notion or Figma. You can also use us to build CRUD apps, and we actually think, CRUD apps is a great use case. Actually, really any application is a great use case. But the main idea is, we want to make it very simple for people to build these delightful applications. And we just have a personal belief that if you take a look at like applications like Figma, one of the reasons why Figma wins the whole market is because of their collaborative and real-time features. Today, this is something that distinguishes the best apps from everyone else. We have a personal belief that this is raising the bar for all apps. And 5 years from now, this feature, which is so distinguishing now, is going to be a commodity. The reality, though, is today it takes a team of engineers to do that. If it's going to be commodity in the future, it means there's going to be some infrastructure solution. We don't know who it's going to be. This is the race that we're in. 5 years from now, there's going to be a product that everyone is taking off the shelf to build modern applications. And that's what we want Instant to be.
Great. I think that was like very precise and good description. And now, like speaking of YC, and I think like Joe is like super excited about YC as he mentioned. So how was it like getting there, and what's this whole experience about YC which you got from that place?
I'm curious, what do you think, so?
Yeah, I mean, I think very similar to Joe, like YC was also like a dream for me. I also, like when I was basically a teenager, would read Paul Graham's essays, and like one of the reasons I like Lisp so much is originally from there. I think YC was like, I'll tell you like in what ways was it surprising, right? So I think one of the most interesting ways it was surprising is you'd think that if you quit your job, you would work like really, really hard, and you would be extremely motivated because like, you're using your savings. But actually, one thing that's even more motivating than all of that is having a community and having like a chance of being embarrassed. So one thing that was great at YC is every 2 weeks you come in, you're surrounded by everybody else who's trying to build products, and you make goals together. So I think that was exceptional. Like we really realized we got to move 10 times faster than we're already moving. The other thing that's very, I think, unique to YC is once you get in, it's almost like benevolent. It really is, I think, the closest thing to benevolent in that they're not, their only interest is for you to succeed, and they don't really care if you fail, right? So because of that, the kind of advice you get is just so real and unique from people, all the partners there have been through the experience you've been through. So I feel like the advice we got was just kind of rare tacit knowledge that hasn't really been written down. And then the final like amazing benefit of it is very often when you're doing kind of startups, for example, if you're raising money, if you're if you're doing negotiations, very often as a startup founder, you're the least experienced person, right? If you're negotiating with an investor, they know 10 times more than you know. And one of the secrets of YC is, well, now you have somebody on your side who's like even more experienced than the investor, right? Because the partners see 10 times, 15 times the kind of flow that a normal investor sees. So very often, like, we'd have 10 p.m. phone calls with our partner who would help us out. So I think it was, sometimes nowadays people say, should you do IC? And like, it's a question. For us, like, it was one of the best things we could have done.
Good. And maybe you can kind of, but by the way, what was your state in the project when you applied? I mean, it was like you were in the process of building, you already had one, or?
We didn't have any code.
Yeah.
So we were at the idea stage, which I think YC is like trying to publish more stats around this, because it feels like there's a lot of misconception where people think, oh, I have to be at this much later stage to get into YC. But I think it's something like 50% or even more now of people who are getting in are at the idea stage. That doesn't mean that you should be like, oh, all I need is an idea to get in. When you apply to YC, you should be intentional about it. But, I think it's very common for people to say like, oh, before I apply to YC, I actually need to do A, B, and C first. And we really encourage you to not do that. You should just apply to YC. You should be intentional in your application. If you're spending like weeks and weeks on this and you're like stressing over it, that's probably a bad idea. You should just time box it, but you should apply. You should apply, you should get in. Whatever stage you're at is the stage that you're at. And when you're at YC, just use that time to get as much work as you can get done. And and then don't stop. Really,
cool.
After that,
faster is very important.
Yeah, don't stop.
Yeah.
Like,
That's
if you get into YC, like, yeah, you should just be
Sure.
You should be like, on it.
Cool. Okay. So YC is you're kind of already like past. You already passed that stage, right? You're already out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, out in terms of that some time period, which you spent there. So, what's happening with Instant right now? So, you have some users. So, what's your stage right now?
I would say, so we launched our kind of fully featured MVP where you could build an actual startup on Instant December 22nd, I think, or 23rd. So it was very like 2 days before Christmas. That was a very intense launch. I had to like step inside of an airport like restaurant and finish with Joe. And now, we're talking to users. If you sign up, there's a button where you can literally talk to us. We sit together, we build stuff with our users. We like have these kind of phone calls where we see how they use Instant and make it better. We have one person who's helping us out. Every week we just try to ship things, make Instant better, talk to our users, and that's kind of the stage. I think one thing that our partner told us that took us a while to learn, but it really is the truth, is we were constantly having this kind of programmer problem of, if you code a lot, it's hard to talk to users, because if you talk to a user at 12 p.m., you're going to be distracted, right? So what do? And the answer is you have to do both. Right? It's like literally just not easy. You have to do both. Wake up. Joe and I have started waking up at like 6:30 so that we can have large blocks of time, but still get time to talk to our users. So that's kind of the stage. Talk to users and code.
And speaking of like talking to users, like a couple of weeks ago, I signed up on Instant, and everything happened like exactly like Stefan described. They just reached out to me like in a couple hours. We scheduled a call, and the most fascinating part about that was how you guys were observing me, what I was doing, and how I was trying to figure things out. And I hope like that observation maybe was kind of valuable for you. So, okay, now I think we can kind of go to the end of our conversation. And let me ask the final question. So you already mentioned this kind of non-tech part of building a startup. One thing is obviously talking to users. So how do you deal as tech guys with these non-tech things? And actually, what are they? Things like talking to users, and what are some other things you do other than code?
Well, we have to do, I mean, one, there's like just chores, right? We, right now, like taxes are up. So, we talk to our accountant, make sure that's done, right? When you start the company, you just have to file a whole bunch of forms to incorporate, right? So there's like little chores like that. There's other aspects too of one thing that we like to do is every month, we're actually going to write up our communications today and probably send it out either later today or tomorrow. But every month we kind of write an update to our investors. We also, write a launch post where we explain, here's what we did last month. We make a plan. What are we going to do the next month? One of the things that also in YC, they encouraged us, Michael Siebel, he says like, they're not a big fan of a lot of meetings, but one thing they say is you should have at least one product meeting every whatever cycle it is, whether it's every 1 week or every 2 weeks, whatever you want it to be. Where basically we commit and we say this is what we're going to do. So there's an aspect of, aside from code, we have to talk to users, we have to do chores, we have to plan, we have to communicate. We also think about like, hey, what are the shots we want to take, right? Like in addition to like building and talking to users, there's another aspect of growing, right? So what do we want to do there? Maybe we want to launch an experiment. We build a sample app, right? Or we build a sample experience and we post that on Hacker News or Twitter. Maybe we should write another essay, right? To kind of say like, here's another interesting thing. So there's a lot of stuff. There's also an aspect of hiring, right? Our friend was working with us, right? That wasn't an easy sell. So a lot of times it can feel like there's a bunch of different things to do. And even now, like we're still so early and this is just, what we're dealing with now. I imagine as we grow, there's going to be all these other things that we have to handle. But I think one thing that is important is to just think about like, what is the biggest levers, right? And I think a lot of the times, actually the two biggest levers are just build and talk to users. So it's very easy to get distracted by all these other things. But really, those are the two big things that it seems like you got to do.
Yeah. I would add like the one other thing that's kind of maybe like one thing I notice often in the beginning stages of startups is like, especially for programmers, what'll happen is they'll either code a lot and then won't launch the product, or and usually what happens is right after that they'll say, oh, I made this big mistake. I coded so much and I didn't talk to users. So now I'm not going to code and I'm going to talk to users. But actually that doesn't work very well either, because what are you going to talk to them about, right? So I think kind of the other addition that we learned or experienced through the YC experience was sometimes we'd say, oh, we need to ship instant, and in order to do that, we need to do permissions. To do permissions right, it's going to take us 3 months, right? Well, what if you got it done in 3 weeks? Okay, what if you got it done in a week? What if you got it done like tomorrow, right? So very often, like the solution is compress as much as you can. Like if you think something can you improve the feedback loop? I think that this is the essence of a startup is you have some idea about what a user wants. You need to give it to them, see if it works, and then fix it. And the entire business just orients around making that as fast as possible, right? And I think when you do that, then all of a sudden other things will become like not coding and user. Like the other one would be like, well, okay, once you code, you need to write something, right? Like you need to write what it is. You need to put the documentation. You need to do the design, right? You need to do all these other things that you might think is not like part of a job, but you need to do it to get that feedback loop going extremely quickly.
One of the other things I wonder, and this, I really don't know. This is now more conjecture, but I also wonder, right? Is there a difference, kind of between pre-product market fit and post-product market fit? Right now, we're pre-product market fit, right? I do wonder if once you, and like, I think it probably is always important to have this feedback machine. I think Patrick Collison, he talks about this, this concept of like, in your org, you should be able to have an idea, right? And basically test it or be able to ship it within a day to start getting feedback. And if you can't test changes within a day, this is a smell in, your company or even in your 2-man team, right? Like, why are you so slow at being able to conduct, this experiment? But a lot of this in my mind is this, like, it's like a machine. You want to build this machine so you can iterate and you can discover what do people really want, and how can you actually deliver value. And once you're actually doing that very well and it's repeatable, right, then I think at that point maybe there's like different focuses. It's like, how do I make sure everything is not on fire? How do I grow the org in anticipation of like the more demand there's going to be? So,
Yeah.
Well,
those could be different.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. Maybe talk to users and build that's where we're at now. But sometimes I wonder, like, later on,
Yeah.
if we scale, or I should say when we scale.
and
Well,
sometimes
so
and sometimes you get invited to some podcasts, right? And you need to spend time on that.
Yeah, I think the kind of idea that I'm gleaming from the question is this idea of, like, very often when you first try to start out, it isn't clear, like, what should you be doing, right? Like, should you be coding? Should you be talking to users? What is this? Like, are you a startup founder or not? Like, you can't tell, because, like, what is a startup founder supposed to look like? I think Paul Graham, again, you can see he's our, like, hero. He mentions this, like, it's funny, the way that people think work is like is reflected by these bigger companies, because most people work there. But the most productive companies, they tend to look like, apartments, and, like, people are, like, waking up and starting to code, and there's like it looks like a house basically, rather than an office and all these things, right? So the question is, if you're starting, how do you know you're doing a good job? And I think the way you know that is through your iteration speed, right? So I wouldn't worry like, oh, am I doing the right things? I would say, okay, well, if you're coding, that's great, but when does the coding finish? Like, when's this thing out? If you don't have a date, or you don't know what the goals are, you don't have like some within 1 week I want to get this done, and then in 2 weeks I want to show it to somebody, then you know that something might be a little off, right? And it's the inverse. If you're constantly talking to users, but you have nothing physically built, or nothing that they can really play with, all you're getting are just like conjectures. So that's the kind of advice piece. But yeah, it's something that Joe and I think a lot about. And I think the reality is 99% code and talk to users.
Great. Okay, guys. So we'll now definitely go to the end, and I'm super excited, honestly. And this was by far my favorite podcast episode, really, because I'm genuinely interested in these topics, in kind of mix of this entrepreneurship and hacking. So I had blast talking to you. Thank you once again for your time. And I wish you like nothing but success, growth, and like never stopping kind of thing in your building process. So thanks again.
Heck yeah, man.
Thank you, man. Great chatting with you.